The blood pooled beneath my father's lifeless body, like a crimson lake, reflecting the flickering light of the overturned lantern. In that moment, watching my brother Jude stand over the man who had loved us both, I felt something die inside me, something pure and trusting that would never return. The 11-year-old girl who had awakened that morning, believing in the goodness of people, ceased to exist. In her place stood a survivor, hardened by a horror no child should witness, shaped by a betrayal so complete it would define the rest of my life. The thunder outside seemed to mock my father's final gasps, drowning out the sound of my childhood ending. Hell, I realized, wasn't the fiery pit Pastor Williams preached about on Sundays. Hell was watching evil wear the face of someone you loved, someone you trusted, someone who shared your blood. Hell was the moment I understood that the person who had once carried me on his shoulders through the mountain trails was capable of unspeakable darkness.
My name is Angelina Mason, though most folks in Pine Hollow know me as Granny Angie. I'm 81 years old now, my fingers gnarled with arthritis from decades of quilting my memory, sharp as the day I learned that survival sometimes requires becoming something you never thought you could be. Those who see me today sitting in my rocking chair, handing out peppermint candies to the neighborhood children, can't imagine the story I carry. They can't fathom the carefully orchestrated revenge I spent decades planning, or the cold satisfaction I felt when justice finally came for the monster who destroyed my family.
This is that story. The story of how a terrified child became a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to find peace is to ensure that evil pays its proper price.
I was born in 1944 in a ramshackle cabin in Creekside, a place so remote that when the rains came hard, we'd be cut off from the world for days. The creek would swell and rage, washing away anything foolish enough to stand in its path. Our house sat on stilts, wooden beams, that groaned under the weight of our meager existence. The floors were rough-hewn planks with gaps wide enough for mice to scurry through, and the walls were chinked with mud and moss that had to be replaced every spring. Despite our poverty, there was love in that house. My father, Andrew Mason, was a logger who left before dawn with his tools and his dreams, returning at dusk with timber he'd sell to whoever would buy it. His hands were scarred from years of handling rough wood and sharp blades, but they were gentle when he braided my hair or carved me little wooden dolls from scraps of pine. "Long as we got beans in the pot and each other, we're richer than the Rockefellers," he'd say, his weathered face creasing into a smile that could light up our dim kitchen. My mother, Abigail, was a seamstress whose reputation for fine work spread throughout the hollow. She could take the most threadbare fabric and transform it into something beautiful, something that would make the church ladies jealous. Her fingers danced across cloth like a pianist at her keys, creating magic from scraps and hope. Then there was Jude, my brother 7 years older, and already showing signs of the darkness that would eventually consume him. Even as a child, I sensed something wrong in the way he looked at the world, as if it owed him something he could never quite name. His eyes held a coldness that made me uncomfortable, though I couldn't have articulated why at the time. When I was 10, everything changed. The garment factory in Oak Ridge, 2 days hard travel through mountain passes, offered my mother steady work, at wages that seemed like a fortune compared to what she could earn mending clothes for neighbors. The decision tore at her heart, but practicality won out over emotion. "It's just for a while, baby girl," she promised, holding me close as she packed her few belongings. "Mama's gonna save up enough money to buy us a real house, maybe even one with indoor plumbing. Won't that be something?" At first, she came home every weekend, the journey exhausting her, but her love for us pulling her back. But as weeks turned to months, the visits became less frequent. The roads were treacherous, the work demanding, and the money too good to walk away from. Soon, she was coming home only once a month, then less. With our mother's absence, the house grew cold in ways that had nothing to do with the mountain air. My father
became withdrawn, shouldering the burden of raising 2 children alone while working dawn to dusk, just to keep food on the table. The gentle giant who had once filled our home with laughter now moved through life like a man carrying an invisible weight. But it was the change in Jude that truly frightened me. At 17, he had grown into a man's body, but retained a child's petulance. He began staying out all night, returning home reeking of moonshine and sporting new clothes that our family's meager income couldn't have provided. When my father questioned him, Jude would explode with a rage that seemed to come from somewhere deeper and darker than mere teenage rebellion. "You satisfied living like this?" He'd snarl, gesturing at our humble surroundings. "Happy being nobody having nothing going nowhere? Well, I ain't. I got plans, old man. Big plans." "Ah, and where exactly do you think you're going with no education, no trade, and no sense?" My father would respond, his voice steady despite the hurt I could see in his eyes. "This ain't the life I wanted for you, son, but it's honest work. It puts food on the table. Honest work." Jude's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You call scraping by like animals honest? You call watching your wife run off to live with strangers rather than stay in this shack honest? Face it, Dad, you're a failure. And I ain't gonna end up like you." Those words cut deeper than any blade. I watched my father's shoulders sag a little more with each cruel exchange, saw the light fade from his eyes as his eldest son's contempt grew like a cancer between them. And through it all, I felt the weight of being the only thing keeping our family from complete collapse. The fights escalated. Jude would disappear for days, returning with money he claimed to have earned from odd jobs that he couldn't quite describe. He bought himself a pocket watch, new boots, even a battery-powered radio that seemed impossibly luxurious in our primitive home. When my father demanded to know where the money came from, Jude would grow evasive, then angry, then violent. One evening, I caught him rifling through my father's mattress where the money from timber sales was hidden. When he saw me watching, his face twisted with fury. "You breathe one word of this to him," he hissed, grabbing my arm so hard I cried out, "and I'll make you sorry you were ever born. You understand me, little sister?" The threat in his voice was real, primal. I nodded, too frightened to speak, and said nothing when my father discovered half his savings missing. The accusation and denial that followed shook the house like an earthquake, and I cowered in my corner, watching my family tear itself apart, while I held the key to the truth locked in my throat. That night, after the shouting had ended and Jude had stormed out, my father sat on the edge of my bed. His hand was gentle as he smoothed my hair, but his voice carried a weight that made me pay attention. "Angelina, darling," he said softly, "I need you to understand something. Some folks are born with good hearts, and some are born with hearts full of darkness. No matter how hard you try, you can't change what's already there. Your brother, he's got that darkness in him, and it's growing stronger every day." His eyes met mine, and I saw a fear there that chilled me to the bone. "Promise me something, baby girl. Promise me you'll always stay on the side of light no matter what happens. Promise me you'll never let the world's evil harden your heart." I promised, not understanding then that I was making a vow I would struggle to keep, that the darkness he spoke of would soon touch my life in ways that would challenge everything I believed about good and evil, about justice and mercy, about the very nature of survival itself. The final breaking point came when my mother sent word that she would be staying in Oak Ridge for several more months. The factory had increased production, she wrote, and the overtime pay was too good to pass up. She sent money and a new dress she'd made for me, but her absence felt like another abandonment. Jude's reaction was explosive. See?" he raged, waving the letter in the air. "Even she can't stand this place anymore. She'd rather live with strangers than come home to us.
That should tell you something about how pathetic our lives are.
Your mother is working herself to death for this family. My father shot back his patience, finally wearing thin. She's sacrificing everything to give you and your sister a better future. What future? Jude's voice cracked with bitter laughter.
You mean the future where I end up like you, breaking my back in the woods until I'm too old to work living in a shack that ain't fit for animals? That's not a future, old man. That's a slow death.
The fight that followed was the worst yet. Jude disappeared for a week, and when he returned, he was different. Calmer, almost pleasant. He helped with chores, fixed the leaking roof, even carved me a new wooden doll. My father, desperate to believe his son was finally maturing, chose to see hope where there was only calculation.
Oh, see there, Angelina. He said to me one evening as we shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. Your brother's showing he can change. People can surprise you sometimes.
But I wasn't fooled. There was something predatory in the way Jude watched us like a mountain cat waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was planning something, and whatever it was, I knew it would bring nothing but pain to our already fragile family. I was right to be afraid. The calm before the storm is always the most dangerous time, when the very air seems to hold its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. And when the storm finally broke, it would wash away everything I thought I knew about the world, leaving me to navigate a new reality where the only law was survival, and the only justice was what you could create with your own hands. The rain began just after supper on a Tuesday in October. Fat drops that drummed against our tin roof with increasing urgency. By evening, it had become a deluge, the kind of mountain storm that turns creeks into rivers and washes away anything foolish enough to stand in its path. Lightning split the sky with such frequency that our kitchen seemed to strobe between light and darkness, and the thunder that followed shook our small house to its foundations. My father had come home early from the woods, his clothes soaked, despite the oilskin coat he wore. The storm had made logging impossible, and he'd spent the afternoon in Mr. Patterson's general store playing checkers with the other men who'd been driven indoors by the weather. When he emptied his pockets on the kitchen table, I saw he'd collected payment for the timber he'd delivered the previous week.
Look here, Angelina,
he said, his voice carrying more joy than I'd heard in months. He placed a small stack of bills and coins in my palm.
This is for that new school notebook you've been wanting, the one with the pretty cover. My heart leaped. It was a hardbound notebook with a painted cover showing a mountain meadow full of wildflowers, the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in Mr. Patterson's store. The idea that it might actually belong to me seemed almost too wonderful to believe.
Really, Daddy? You mean it?
I surely do. My little girl deserves nice things. And with what's left over, we can buy supplies for the winter and maybe even put a little aside for when your mama comes home.
The happiness in his voice was infectious, and for a moment, it felt like the old days when laughter came easily, and the future seemed bright with possibility. But that feeling evaporated the moment Jude walked into the kitchen.
He stood in the doorway, his dark hair plastered to his head by the rain, his eyes scanning the money spread across the table with an intensity that made my skin crawl. There was something different about him that night, something cold and calculating that hadn't been there before.
Well, well, he said, his voice deceptively casual.
Looks like Christmas came early. How much you got there, Dad? Enough to get us through the winter without worry.
My father replied, his tone carefully neutral.
And enough to buy your sister the things she needs for school.
Jude laughed, but there was no humor in it. School? What's the point of that? You planning to send her to college, old man? You gonna turn her into one of those fancy ladies with their college degrees and their big city dreams?
I'm planning to give her choices,
my father said firmly.
Something you never seemed to want.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jude's eyes hardened, and I saw his hand drift to his belt, where I knew he kept a knife, the same hunting knife our father had given him for his 16th birthday. Choices. Jude's voice was soft, deadly. The only choice I ever had was to stay in this hellhole and rot or find my own way out. And I chose to find my own way.
By stealing from your own family? The words slipped out before my father could stop them, and I saw Jude's face flush with rage. I never stole nothing from nobody, he snarled. I took what was rightfully mine, what you never would have given me otherwise.
You're my son, my father said, his voice breaking with emotion. Everything I have, everything I am, it's all for you and your sister. How could you not know that?
For a moment, something flickered in Jude's eyes. Something that might have been regret or pain or even love. But it was gone so quickly. I might have imagined it replaced by the cold hardness that had become his default expression.
Pretty words, he said, pulling the knife from his belt.
But words don't buy freedom. Words don't get you out of this God-forsaken place. Money does.
The blade gleamed in the lamplight, its edge honed to razor sharpness. I'd seen my father use that knife countless times to cut rope to skin game, to carve the wooden toys he made for me. Now it was pointed at his heart, held by the son he'd raised and loved and tried so hard to save.
Put that away, Jude, my father said quietly. You don't want to do this. Don't I?
Jude stepped closer, the knife steady in his hand. You think I haven't thought about this? You think I haven't imagined what it would be like to finally be free of you, free of this place, free of the guilt and the shame and the constant reminder of what a failure I am?
You're not a failure, son. You're just lost. But we can fix that. We can...
No. Jude's voice was a roar that competed with the thunder outside. You can't fix anything. You couldn't fix your marriage. You couldn't fix this house. You couldn't fix me. All you can do is sit here and pretend that everything's going to be okay while the world falls apart around you.
My father stood slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. All right, son. You want the money? Take it. Take all of it. Just put the knife down. But Jude wasn't listening anymore. His eyes had gone glassy, unfocused, as if he were looking at something only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice was different, calm, almost conversational.
You know what the worst part is, Dad? It's not that you're a failure. It's that you're content to be a failure. You've given up on everything, your dreams, your family, yourself. And you expect me to do the same.
The lantern chose that moment to flicker, casting dancing shadows across the walls. In the uncertain light, Jude looked like a stranger, his features twisted by hatred and something else, something that might have been madness.
I won't end up like you, he whispered. I won't.
What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a nightmare. My father lunged forward, trying to grab the knife, and Jude stepped back, his arm swinging in a wide arc. The blade caught the lamplight for a split second before it disappeared into my father's chest, sliding between his ribs with a sound like ripping fabric. Time seemed to slow. My father's eyes went wide with shock and pain, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Only a thin trickle of blood that ran down his chin and dripped onto the floor. He looked at Jude with an expression of infinite sadness, as if he were seeing his son clearly for the first time.
Then he collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the house. The overturned lantern rolled away, its flame guttering and dying, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the lightning that flickered through the windows. I stood frozen in the corner, my hand pressed to my mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to tear from my throat. In the brief illumination of the lightning, I saw my father's body lying, still, saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt, saw Jude standing over him with the bloody knife still in his hand.
And then Jude turned and saw me.
His eyes met mine across the darkened room, and what I saw there froze the blood in my veins. There was no remorse, no horror, no shock at what he had done. Only a cold calculation, as if he were solving a problem that had just become more complicated.
Well, well, he said, his voice eerily calm. Look what we have here. A little witness to our family tragedy.
I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Terror had rooted me to the spot, and I could only watch as Jude stepped over our father's body and approached me. "You see what you made me do, Angelina?" he said, crouching down so we were at eye level. "This is your fault, too. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't been his precious little darling, maybe things would have been different." I won't tell anyone," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. "I promise." He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Oh, I know you won't, because if you do, I'll tell everyone that you helped me, that you held him down while I stuck the knife in. Who do you think they'll believe, a grieving brother or a scared little girl?" The logic was twisted but effective. Even at 11, I understood that my word would mean nothing against his. He was older, stronger, and had a talent for manipulation that I was only beginning to understand. "Here's what's going to happen," he continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. "You're going to help me clean up this mess. We're going to bury dear old Dad in the woods where nobody will find him. And then we're going to live like a happy family until Mama comes home." "She'll ask where he is," I managed to say. "And we'll tell her he went to work at the logging camp up north, that he'll be gone for months, maybe years. By the time she realizes something's wrong, it'll be too late to matter." He stood up, wiping the knife clean on my father's shirt before sliding it back into his belt. "Now come on, little sister, we have work to do." The next few hours passed in a blur of horror. Jude forced me to help him drag our father's body out into the storm, through the mud and the rain, to a spot beneath the old apple tree where the ground was soft enough to dig. While I held the lantern, he worked with a shovel, carving out a grave that would hide our family's darkest secret. When it was done, when the last shovelful of earth had been packed down and covered with fallen leaves, Jude grabbed my shoulders and looked directly into my eyes. "Remember, Angelina, you're just as guilty as I am now. You helped bury him. You're an accessory to murder. If you ever tell anyone what happened here, I'll make sure you go to prison right alongside me. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood anything anymore. My world had been turned upside down, and I was clinging to survival by the thinnest of threads. We returned to the house as dawn was breaking the storm, having finally exhausted itself. Jude cleaned the kitchen with methodical efficiency, scrubbing away every trace of blood, righting the furniture, making everything look normal. By the time he was finished, there was no sign that a murder had taken place just hours before. "Now," he said, sitting down at the table where my father had counted his money just the night before, "we need to talk about the new rules." The money was gone, of course. Jude had taken it all along with whatever savings he could find hidden throughout the house. He counted it with the same methodical precision he'd shown in cleaning up the crime scene. "This should last us a while," he said, more to himself than to me. "Long enough to figure out the next step." "What about school?" I asked, my voice small and frightened. "You'll keep going. Act normal. If anyone asks about Dad, you tell them he went to work at the logging camp. He'll be back eventually, you just don't know when." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those cold, calculating eyes. "And Angelina, if you even think about running about telling anyone what really happened, I'll find you. And when I do, I'll make sure you join Dad under that apple tree. Are we clear?" I nodded, though inside I was already planning my escape. I couldn't stay in this house, couldn't live with the monster my brother had become. But I also couldn't run blindly into the wilderness. I needed a plan, a destination, a way to survive. Most of all, I needed to find my mother. She was the only person who might believe me, the only one who might be able to help me. But Oak Ridge was 2 days away through dangerous mountain country, and I was just a frightened 11-year-old girl. Still, as I sat in that kitchen, surrounded by the ghost of my father's presence and the very real threat of my brother's violence, I made a vow. I would survive this. I would find a way to escape. And someday, somehow, I would make sure that justice was served. I didn't know then that justice would take nearly 30 years to arrive, or that when it finally came, it would be by my own hand. I didn't know that the terrified child sitting in that kitchen would grow into a woman capable of patience, calculation, and a cold determination that would have frightened even Jude. All I knew was that I had to survive, and sometimes survival is the first step towards something much more dangerous than death. The days following my father's murder passed in a haze of fear and desperate planning. I attended school as if nothing had happened, sitting in the back row of our one-room schoolhouse, staring at the blackboard without seeing the lessons written there. Mrs. Hartley, our teacher, asked me several times if I was feeling well, her kind eyes clouded with concern. "I'm fine, ma'am." I would lie, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass on my lips. "Just tired is all." But I wasn't fine. I was dying inside, consumed by guilt and terror and the crushing weight of the secret I carried. At night, I would lie on my narrow bed, listening to Jude move around the house, afraid to close my eyes, lest I wake to find him standing over me with that same cold smile he'd worn after killing our father. He had settled into the role of grieving son with disturbing ease, telling neighbors that our father had gone to work at a logging camp up north. When Mrs. Crenshaw from down the valley stopped by with a casserole and asked when he might return, Jude's performance was flawless. "Could be months," he said, his voice heavy with just the right amount of sadness. "You know how these jobs are. But the pay's good, and we need the money with Mama still in Oak Ridge." Mrs. Crenshaw clucked sympathetically and patted his shoulder. "You're being so brave taking care of your little sister like this. Your daddy would be proud." If only she knew the truth. If only any of them knew what kind of monster lived behind Jude's carefully constructed facade. As the weeks passed, I began to notice changes in my brother that terrified me even more than his violence. He would catch me staring at him and smile that cold, predatory smile. His eyes would linger on me in ways that made my skin crawl. And sometimes, late at night, I would hear him moving around outside my room, testing the latch on my door. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning when I returned from fetching water at the spring. Jude was waiting for me in the kitchen, 3 empty bottles of moonshine on the table before him, his eyes glazed with drink, and something else, something that made every instinct I possessed scream in warning. "You're getting to be a real pretty girl, Angelina," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Starting to look just like Mama did when she was young." I set down the water bucket and backed toward the door. "I need to do the washing." "The washing can wait." He stood up, swaying slightly. "Come here, little sister. Come sit with your brother." There was something in his voice, something hungry and dark, that made my blood turn to ice. I knew that if I obeyed, if I went to him, something terrible would happen. Something that would destroy what little innocence I had left. So I ran. I bolted out the door and into the woods, crashing through underbrush and leaping over fallen logs with the desperation of a hunted animal. Behind me, I could hear Jude shouting, his voice growing fainter as I put distance between us. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled with exhaustion. Finally, I collapsed beside a small stream, gasping for air and trying to think. I couldn't go back to the house. Not now. Not ever. Jude had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and I knew with terrible certainty that he would try again. As I sat there in the gathering dusk, listening to the sound of water rushing over stones, I made my decision. I would go to my mother. I would find a way to reach Oak Ridge no matter how dangerous the journey. It was my only hope. I waited until full darkness before creeping back to the house. Jude's snores echoed through the thin walls, and I could smell the sour stench of liquor on his breath, even from the kitchen. Moving as quietly as I could, I gathered a few belongings, a change of clothes, my father's old coat, a small knife he'd given me for carving wood. I also took what little money I could find, coins hidden in various places around the house. Before I left, I stood for a moment in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at the spot where my father had died. In the pale moonlight, I could almost see his ghost, his gentle face twisted with pain and betrayal. I whispered a silent goodbye, promising him that I would find a way to honor his memory and make his killer pay. Then I slipped out into the night and began the long journey that would transform me from a frightened child into something far more dangerous. The first day of my escape was a nightmare of wrong turns and false starts. I had only a vague idea of which direction Oak Ridge lay, and the mountain trails were treacherous even in daylight. I followed game paths and old logging roads, stopping frequently to rest and eat the few berries and nuts I could find. By evening, I was exhausted, hungry, and completely lost. I took shelter in an abandoned cabin I found deep in the woods, its roof partially collapsed and its walls covered with decades of moss and decay. As I huddled in the corner wrapped in my father's oversized coat, I wondered if I would ever see my mother again. The sound of voices woke me just after dawn. I peered through a gap in the cabin's wall and saw two men approaching, their faces hard and unfamiliar. My heart raced as I recognized the type, the kind of men who lived on the edges of civilization, who made their living from activities that decent people didn't talk about. "Someone's been here," one of them said, studying the ground around the cabin. "Recent tracks. Could be hunters," the other replied. "Or maybe someone from the Coulson family checking on their still." They were moonshiners, I realized. This cabin must be part of their operation. If they found me, there was no telling what they might do to keep their secret safe. I held my breath as they circled the cabin, their boots crunching on the fallen leaves. One of them peered through the same gap I was using to watch them, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he'd spotted me. But he turned away, apparently satisfied that the cabin was empty. "Probably just some animal," he said to his companion. "Come on, let's check the still." They disappeared into the woods, and I waited another hour before daring to move. When I finally crept out of the cabin, I found myself on a ridge overlooking a valley I didn't recognize. In the distance, I could see a road, a real road, not just a dirt track winding through the mountains. It took me most of the day to reach the road, and when I finally stumbled onto the dusty surface, I was near collapse. My feet were bleeding, my throat was parched, and I hadn't eaten anything substantial in more than 24 hours. That's when I heard the sound of horse hooves approaching. I turned to see a rider coming toward me, and my blood turned to ice when I recognized the figure. It was Jude, mounted on a bay horse I'd never seen before, his face a mask of cold fury. "There you are, little sister," he said, dismounting with predatory grace. "I've been looking all over for you." His arm was wrapped in a crude bandage, and I noticed he favored his left side as he walked. I must have hurt him more than I'd realized during my escape. "You shouldn't have run from me, Angelina," he continued, his voice deceptively calm. "Now I have to teach you a lesson about obedience." He reached for me, and instinct took over. My hand closed around a rock the size of my fist, and I swung it with all the strength I had left. The stone connected with his temple with a sickening crack, and he staggered backward, his eyes rolling up to show the whites. For a moment, I thought I'd killed him. He dropped to his knees, then fell forward onto his face, blood pooling beneath his head. But I could see his chest rising and falling, and I knew I had only moments before he recovered. I grabbed the horse's reins and somehow managed to haul myself into the saddle.
The animals, sensing my urgency, responded to my clumsy commands and began to trot down the road. I looked back once and saw Jude trying to push himself up on his hands and knees, his face a mask of blood and rage. The ride to Oak Ridge took 2 days, and they were the longest 2 days of my life. I had to stop frequently to rest, both for my own sake and the horses. I slept in barns when I could find them in the woods when I couldn't. I ate apples stolen from orchards and drank from streams that ran clear and cold down the mountainsides. All the while, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Jude appear at any moment. The blow to his head had been severe, but I knew it wouldn't stop him for long. He would come after me, and when he did, he would be angrier than ever. Oak Ridge. When I finally reached it, was like nothing I'd ever seen. The buildings were made of brick and stone, not wood and mud. The streets were paved with actual cobblestones, and gas lamps flickered in the gathering dusk. It was civilization, real civilization, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Finding the garment factory was easier than I'd expected. It was the largest building in town, a 3-story brick structure with St. Rita's Garments painted in large letters across the front. I tied the horse to a hitching post and walked through the front door on unsteady legs. The woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger book, and her eyes widened when she saw my condition. I must have looked like a scarecrow, dirty, exhausted, and half-starved. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I'm looking for my mother," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Abigail Mason. She works here." The woman's face brightened. "Oh, you must be Angelina. Your mother talks about you all the time. Let me get her for you." She disappeared through a door at the back of the room, and a few moments later, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, my mother's voice calling my name. "Angelina. Oh, my darling girl. What are you doing here?" And then she was there, rushing toward me with tears streaming down her face. I collapsed into her arms, and for the first time since that terrible night, I felt safe. But I knew the safety was temporary. Jude would find me eventually, and when he did, he would bring his violence and his threats and his terrible plans. I had escaped his immediate reach, but I hadn't escaped his shadow. Still, as I held my mother and felt her love surround me like a warm blanket, I allowed myself a moment of hope. I had survived the worst thing I could imagine. I had found my way across dangerous country and reunited with the person I loved most in the world. Now, all I had to do was convince her to believe the impossible truth about her eldest son, and then figure out how to build a life that would be safe from his reaching hands. It wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worthwhile ever was. My mother's small room behind the garment factory became my sanctuary. It was hardly bigger than a closet, with just enough space for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small stove. But after the horror of living with Jude, it felt like a palace. She bathed me gently, her hands shaking as she saw the cuts and bruises that covered my body. She fed me warm soup and bread, and only when I was clean and fed did she ask the question I'd been dreading. "Tell me what happened, sweetheart. Where's your father? Where's Jude?" The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in my haste to finally tell someone the truth. I told her about the escalating fights about the money Jude had stolen, about the terrible night when everything went wrong. I told her about the knife and the blood and the shallow grave beneath the apple tree. When I finished, my mother sat in stunned silence, her face pale as moonlight. I could see her struggling to process what I'd told her, trying to reconcile the image of her difficult but beloved son with the monster I'd described. "Are you certain, Angelina?" she asked finally. "Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" "I saw him do it, Mama. I saw him kill Daddy, and then he threatened to kill me too if I told anyone." She pulled me into her arms, and I felt her tears falling on my hair. "Oh, my baby, my poor sweet baby. I should never have left you alone with him. I should have known." But our reunion was interrupted by a loud knocking at the door.
My mother and I looked at each other, fear passing between us like an electric current. The knocking came again, more insistent this time.
Mrs. Mason, this is Sheriff Brennan. I need to speak with you about your daughter.
My mother squeezed my hand. Whatever happens, I believe you, she whispered. I believe every word. She opened the door to reveal a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes. Behind him stood a deputy, and behind them, both like a nightmare made flesh, was Jude. He looked terrible. His head was wrapped in dirty bandages, and his eyes were black with bruises. But there was something else in his expression, a cold satisfaction that made my blood run cold.
Mrs. Mason, the sheriff said, removing his hat. I'm afraid your son has made some serious accusations against your daughter. He says she stole his horse and attempted to murder him.
My mother's spine stiffened. Sheriff, I need to tell you something. My daughter has made some very serious accusations of her own. What followed was the most difficult conversation of my life. Sitting in that small room, surrounded by men who held my fate in their hands, I told my story once again. I watched their faces as I spoke, saw doubt and suspicion, and in the sheriff's case, a growing sense of concern.
Jude, for his part, played his role perfectly. He denied everything, of course, his voice breaking with just the right amount of emotion.
She's lying, Sheriff. She's been having nightmares since our father left for the logging camp. Sometimes she can't tell the difference between dreams and reality.
Your father left for a logging camp? The sheriff asked, his brow furrowing. When was this?
3 weeks ago. He got a job offer up north, said the pay was too good to pass up. He told us he'd be gone for months.
The sheriff made notes in a small book, his expression thoughtful.
And you say your daughter attacked you?
She hit me with a rock, Sheriff. Nearly killed me. Then she stole my horse and ran away. I've been looking for her ever since. I wanted to scream at the injustice of it all. Here was my brother, a cold-blooded killer, painting himself as the victim while I was made to look like a delusional child. But I forced myself to remain calm, to tell the truth as clearly and convincingly as I could.
If what I'm saying is true,
I said, looking directly at the sheriff, then you'll find my father's body buried under the apple tree in our backyard. Jude killed him and made me help bury him.
The sheriff closed his notebook and stood up. I'll need to send some men to check on this. In the meantime, you'll all need to stay in town, where I can keep an eye on you.
The waiting was agony. 3 days passed before the sheriff returned, and I could tell from his expression that everything had changed. His face was grim, his manner formal and official.
We found the body, he said simply. Andrew Mason buried exactly where the girl said he would be.
My mother collapsed into a chair, finally allowing herself to grieve for the man she'd loved and lost. I felt a mixture of relief and sorrow relief that the truth had finally come out, sorrow that my father's death was now horribly, officially real.
Jude's facade cracked for just a moment, and I saw something wild and desperate flash in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, his voice taking on a pleading tone. I can explain, Sheriff. It was self-defense. He came at me with a knife, and I had to protect myself. I was scared, so I buried him and told everyone he'd gone away. I was just a boy, I didn't know what else to do. But the sheriff had seen enough violence in his career to recognize the difference between self-defense and murder. The forensic evidence, the angle of the wound, the lack of defensive injuries on my father's body, told a story that contradicted Jude's claims.
Jude Mason, he said, his voice heavy with authority. You're under arrest for the murder of Andrew Mason. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Jude's wrists, he looked at me with such pure hatred that I actually stepped backward. His lips moved, forming words that only I could understand.
This isn't over, he mouthed. I'll find you.
And I knew with a cold certainty that settled in my bones like winter frost that he was right. This wasn't over. It was just beginning.
The trial of Jude Mason became the biggest news Pine Hollow had seen in decades. People came from miles around to sit in the overcrowded courtroom, eager to hear the details of a crime that had shattered the illusion of safety in our small mountain community. I testified for 2 days, telling and retelling the story of that terrible night. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Coleman, guided me through the events with patience and skill. He helped me describe not just what I'd seen, but what I'd felt: the terror, the helplessness, the desperate need to survive. The defense attorney, a younger man who'd been assigned to Jude's case, did his best to portray me as a confused child whose memories couldn't be trusted. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and my testimony was corroborated by the forensic findings. Throughout the trial, Jude sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of cold indifference. He never looked at me directly, but I could feel his hatred like a physical presence. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood up and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the courtroom. "I loved my father," he said, his voice catching just enough to sound genuine. "What happened that night was a tragedy, but it wasn't murder. It was a young man defending himself against a violent attack. I'll carry the guilt of his death for the rest of my life, but I won't apologize for surviving." It was a masterful performance, but it wasn't enough to save him. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on all charges. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, sentenced Jude to 25 years in the state penitentiary. As the bailiff led him away, Jude finally looked at me. His eyes were flat and cold like a snake's, and his lips curved in a smile that promised terrible things. 25 years, he said, his voice barely audible, but carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. "I'll be 41 when I get out, still young enough to finish what I started." The words hit me like a physical blow. Even in defeat, even facing decades in prison, Jude was still planning his revenge. The trial might be over, but the war between us was just beginning. After the sentencing, my mother and I left Pine Hollow forever. There was nothing left for us there except painful memories and whispered conversations. We settled in Oak Ridge, where my mother continued working at the garment factory, and I finished my education at the local school. But I never forgot Jude's promise. As the years passed, I found myself thinking about him, constantly wondering what he was doing in his cell, what he was planning for his eventual release. I read everything I could about the prison system, about rehabilitation and recidivism, about the psychological profiles of violent criminals. What I learned terrified me. Men like Jude, men who killed without remorse and blamed their victims for their own crimes, rarely changed. Prison might contain them for a while, but it seldom reformed them. If anything, it often made them worse, more cunning, more careful, more dangerous. By the time I turned 18, I had made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I wasn't going to wait for Jude to find me. I was going to prepare for his return, and when he finally walked out of prison, I would be ready for him. The first step was financial independence. I had discovered that I had inherited my mother's talent for sewing, and I began taking on additional work making dresses and suits for the wealthy families in Oak Ridge. My reputation grew quickly, and soon I was earning more money than many men in town. I saved every penny I could, investing in small businesses and real estate. I learned to read financial statements and market trends. I studied the law, understanding my rights and the limits of what I could legally do to protect myself. More importantly, I studied people. I learned to read faces and body language to understand the subtle dynamics of power and influence. I made friends with policemen and judges, lawyers, and businessmen. I became a fixture in the community, known for my charity work and my gentle manner. No one suspected that beneath the surface, I was building something far more dangerous than a successful business. I was building a network, a web of relationships and obligations that would serve me well when the time came to defend myself.
My mother died when I was 28, her heart finally giving out after years of hard work and worry. I mourned her deeply, but I also felt a strange sense of liberation. With her gone, I no longer had to worry about protecting anyone but myself.
I continued to monitor Jude's progress through the prison system, using my connections to gather information about his behavior and his plans. What I learned confirmed my worst fears. He had spent his time in prison, not reforming, but planning. He had made friends with other violent criminals, men who shared his contempt for society and his appetite for revenge. More disturbingly, he had been writing letters, dozens of them, to people in Oak Ridge and the surrounding area. He was gathering information about me, about my life, about my vulnerabilities. He was preparing for his return with the same methodical patience I was using to prepare for his arrival. When word came that Jude would be released on parole after serving 20 years of his sentence, I felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. The boy who had killed our father was now a man hardened by decades of prison life and fueled by an obsession with revenge. But I was no longer the terrified 11-year-old who had witnessed his crime. I was a successful businesswoman with resources and connections, a woman who had spent 20 years preparing for this moment. I was ready for him. The question was he ready for me?
The day I learned of Jude's parole, I sat in my office above the dress shop I now owned, staring at the official letter until the words blurred together. After 20 years of preparation, the moment I had both dreaded and anticipated was finally approaching.
I had built a good life in Oak Ridge. My business was thriving. I owned 3 properties in town, and I had the respect of the community. I had even found love, a kind, gentle man named Sebastian, who had lost his wife to consumption 5 years earlier. We had married the previous spring, and for the first time in decades, I had allowed myself to feel truly happy.
But happiness was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. Jude would be released in 6 months, and I knew he would come for me. The question was not if, but when and how.
I began my preparations immediately. First, I hired a private investigator to monitor Jude's activities in prison and to track his movements once he was released. I needed to know where he would go, who he would contact, what resources he would have available. The information I received was both expected and disturbing. Jude had maintained correspondence with several criminals from the region, men who had been released and were now living on the margins of society. He had also been writing to people in Oak Ridge, asking subtle questions about my life and my routines. Most troubling of all, he had been corresponding with a man named Curtis Webb, a former cellmate who had been released 2 years earlier. Webb had a history of violence and had been arrested several times for assault and robbery. According to my investigator, Webb was now living in a boarding house just 20 miles from Oak Ridge. The pattern was clear. Jude was building his own network, assembling the tools he would need to carry out his revenge. He was playing the same long game I had been playing, but from the opposite side. I decided to make the first move. Using my connections in the business community, I arranged for Curtis Webb to be evicted from his boarding house. It wasn't difficult a word to the right people about his criminal record, a suggestion that his presence might be bad for business, and suddenly his rent was being raised to an amount he couldn't afford. When Webb tried to find alternative lodging, he discovered that every boarding house and cheap hotel in the area had suddenly become reluctant to accept him as a tenant. Doors that had been open before were now closed, and the few places that would consider him demanded deposits he couldn't afford. Within a month, Webb was living on the streets, scraping together money for food and shelter. His letters to Jude became increasingly desperate, and according to my investigator, he had begun drinking heavily and associating with even more dangerous criminals. I felt a cold satisfaction as I watched Webb's life spiral downward. He had chosen to ally himself with a killer, and now he was paying the price. It was a preview of what I had planned for Jude himself. The next phase of my plan involved gathering intelligence on Jude's other associates. I hired additional investigators, used my connections in the legal system, and gradually built a comprehensive picture of the network he was trying to create. One by one, I began to dismantle it. Men who had promised to help Jude suddenly found themselves facing legal troubles or financial difficulties. Jobs that had been promised evaporated. Favors that had been agreed upon were suddenly forgotten. By the time Jude was released, he would find himself more alone than he had ever been. His network of support would have crumbled, his resources would be limited, and his options would be few. But I knew that would only make him more desperate. And desperate men were often the most dangerous of all. I couldn't simply wait for him to make his move. I needed to force him into a position where he would be vulnerable, where I could control the terms of our final confrontation. The solution came to me as I was reading one of his letters intercepted by my investigator. In it, Jude wrote about his plans to reclaim the family property in Pine Hollow, the cabin where our father had been killed. He seemed to believe that he had some legal claim to the land, that he could return there and rebuild his life. It was a fantasy, of course. The property had been sold for taxes years ago, and the new owners had no intention of selling it to the man who had murdered the previous owner. But Jude didn't know that yet, and I intended to use his ignorance against him. I contacted the current owners of the property, a logging company, that had been using the land for timber harvesting. Through a series of intermediaries, I arranged to purchase the property at a significant premium. The company was happy to sell, especially since they had already harvested most of the valuable timber. Now I owned the place where my father had died, where my childhood had ended, where my brother had revealed his true nature. It seemed fitting that it would also be the place where our long war finally came to an end. As Jude's release date approached, I put the final pieces of my plan into motion. I arranged for him to receive information about the property sale carefully crafted to make it appear that the land had been sold to a development company that planned to build a resort on the site. I knew that the idea of strangers building on what he considered his family's land would enrage him. More importantly, I knew that he would see it as another injustice to be corrected, another wrong to be righted through violence. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for him to walk into it. 3 days before his scheduled release, I received a call from my investigator. Jude had been asking questions about transportation to Pine Hollow, about the current condition of the old cabin, about who now controlled the land. "He's planning to go there," the investigator told me. "Probably as soon as he gets out. He seems obsessed with the idea of reclaiming the property." I thanked him and hung up the phone, then sat back in my chair and smiled. After 20 years of preparation, the endgame was finally beginning. Jude thought he was returning to claim his birthright, but he was actually walking into a carefully prepared trap. I had learned patience from my mother, determination from my father, and ruthlessness from my brother. Now I would use all three to ensure that justice was finally served. The scared little girl who had witnessed her father's murder was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to defeat a monster was to become something even more dangerous. And I was ready to be exactly that. Jude Mason walked out of the state penitentiary on a cold March morning, carrying nothing but a cardboard suitcase and 20 years of accumulated rage. I watched from my car across the street, studying the man my brother had become. Prison had changed him. The boy who had killed our father had been wild and impulsive, driven by emotion and circumstance. The man who emerged from those gray walls was something else entirely controlled, calculating, shaped by 2 decades of violence and survival. He was thinner than I remembered his face, gaunt and marked by scars that spoke of fights and worse. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his eyes held the flat, dead look of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. But it was his manner that truly unsettled me. He moved with the careful precision of a predator, his head turning constantly, his eyes cataloging every detail of his surroundings. This was not the reckless boy I had known. This was a man who had learned to think before he acted, to plan before he struck. I followed him at a distance as he made his way into town, noting the way he avoided crowds and kept to the shadows. He stopped at a pawn shop where he traded something from his suitcase for a small amount of cash. Then he went to a diner where he sat alone at a corner table and ate slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving the door. After finishing his meal, he made a phone call from the payphone outside the diner. I was too far away to hear what he said, but I could see the frustration in his body language. Whoever he was trying to reach wasn't answering or wasn't available. Curtis Webb, I thought. He was trying to contact his former cellmate, not knowing that Webb was now living on the streets, too drunk and desperate to be of any use to anyone. For the rest of the day, I watched as Jude tried to contact his other associates, only to discover that his carefully constructed network had crumbled. Men who had promised to help him were suddenly unavailable. Jobs that had been promised had evaporated. The support system he had spent years building had collapsed. By evening, I could see the anger building in him. His movements became more aggressive, his expression darker. He was beginning to realize that his plans were falling apart, that he was more alone than he had ever been.
Good. Angry men made mistakes, and I was counting on Jude to make a very big one.
That night, he found lodging at a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. I watched from my car as he checked in, paying cash for a room that probably wasn't much better than his prison cell. Through the thin curtains, I could see him pacing back and forth, his silhouette moving restlessly in the yellow light. The next morning, he began asking questions about me. He visited the courthouse where he tried to access public records about my business dealings. He went to the library where he looked up newspaper articles about my marriage and my community activities. He was gathering intelligence just as I had been doing about him. But unlike me, he was doing it clumsily, openly, in a way that drew attention. Within hours, word had reached me through my network of contacts that Andrew Mason's son was in town, asking questions about his sister. I let him gather his information. I wanted him to know how successful I had become, how well I had done in the years since his imprisonment. I wanted him to understand that the terrified little girl he remembered was gone, replaced by a woman of substance and influence. More importantly, I wanted him to discover the information about the Pine Hollow property. I had arranged for the relevant documents to be easily accessible, filed in the public records in a way that would make them simple to find. It didn't take him long. On his second day in town, he found the property transfer documents showing that the old family land had been sold to a development company. The documents were forgeries, of course, carefully crafted to fuel his rage and drive him toward the trap I had prepared. The effect was immediate and dramatic. He stormed out of the courthouse, his face flushed with anger, his hands clenched into fists. He walked directly to the nearest bar, where he proceeded to drink himself into a fury. I watched from across the street as he raged to anyone who would listen about the injustice of it all. His family's land, he said, stolen by greedy developers who wanted to build a resort on his father's grave. His birthright sold out from under him while he was locked away for a crime he claimed was self-defense. It was a masterful performance, and I could see that he was winning sympathy from some of the other patrons. But I also noticed that his anger was genuine, that beneath the calculated manipulation was real rage at real injustice. Perfect. Genuine emotion would make him reckless, and recklessness would make him vulnerable. That night, he made another series of phone calls, this time to people in the Pine Hollow area. He was asking about transportation, about the condition of the old cabin, about who he might contact regarding the property sale. He was planning to go there just as I had known he would. The trap was drawing him in, and he was walking toward it with the inevitability of a moth flying toward a flame. I spent the next few days making my own preparations. I drove to Pine Hollow, to the property I now owned, and surveyed the terrain. The old cabin was gone, torn down years ago by the logging company, but the foundation remained. So did the apple tree where my father was buried now, grown tall and thick with age.
I walked through the woods I had once fled through as a terrified child, noting the paths and the hiding places, the streams and the clearings. I was no longer running from this place. I was claiming it, making it mine, turning it into the stage for the final act of our long drama.
On the fourth day after his release, Jude finally made his move. He rented a car using false identification, a skill he had apparently learned in prison, and drove toward Pine Hollow. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear.
This was it. After 20 years of preparation, the moment of truth had finally arrived. One way or another, the long war between us was about to end. As we drove through the mountain passes of my childhood, I found myself thinking about my father, about the gentle man who had loved his children despite their flaws, who had tried to save a son who couldn't be saved. He had died believing in the possibility of redemption, in the power of love to overcome darkness. I no longer shared that belief. I had learned that some darkness was too deep to be redeemed, some evil too pure to be forgiven. I had learned that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to destroy the guilty, that sometimes justice required a firm hand and a cold heart. As we neared Pine Hollow, I whispered a prayer to my father's memory, asking for his forgiveness for what I was about to do. Then I steeled myself for the confrontation that would determine whether I would finally be free of my brother's shadow, or whether I would join him in the darkness that had consumed our family. The endgame was about to begin, and only one of us would walk away from it alive. I arrived at the Pine Hollow property an hour before Jude, giving myself time to prepare. The old cabin was gone, as I had known it would be, but the stone foundation remained like a scar on the landscape. The apple tree had grown massive in the decades since my father's burial, its branches spreading wide and casting deep shadows across the ground. I positioned myself behind a fallen log about 50 yards from the foundation, with a clear view of the clearing, but hidden from anyone approaching from the main road. I had brought a rifle, a hunting rifle that I had purchased legally and learned to use well during my years of preparation. The wait was agonizing. Every sound in the forest made my heart race. Every movement in the shadows might have been Jude approaching. I found myself thinking about the irony of it all, returning to the place where my childhood had ended to finish what my brother had started all those years ago. When I finally heard the car approaching, my hands began to shake. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to remain calm. I had planned this moment for 20 years, and I couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Jude emerged from the car like a ghost returning to haunt the scene of his crime. He was dressed in dark clothing, and he moved with the careful precision I had observed in town. He walked directly to the old foundation, his eyes scanning the area with the intensity of a predator. For a long moment, he simply stood there, staring at the spot where our kitchen had been, where our father had died. I wondered what he was thinking, what memories were playing in his mind. Was he remembering the good times, the rare moments when our family had been happy? Or was he only thinking about the violence, the blood, the power he had felt when he took another man's life?
Then he began to walk toward the apple tree.
I watched through the rifle scope as he approached our father's grave. He knelt beside the tree, placing his hand on the ground where I knew the body was buried. His lips moved as if he were speaking, but I was too far away to hear the words. Part of me wanted to believe he was expressing remorse that 20 years in prison had given him the wisdom to understand the magnitude of his crime. But I knew better. Men like Jude didn't change. They only became more dangerous.
My suspicions were confirmed when he stood up and began to shout.
"I know you're here, Angelina." His voice echoed through the forest, harsh and angry. "I know you've been watching me manipulating things, trying to control my life from the shadows. Well, I'm here now, and I'm not running anymore."
I remained hidden, my finger on the trigger, waiting for the right moment. He was in the open now, exposed and vulnerable. I could end it right here, right now, with a single shot, but something held me back. Maybe it was curiosity about what he would do next. Or maybe it was the part of me that still remembered the brother he had been before the darkness consumed him. Either way, I decided to wait.
You think you're so smart, don't you? He continued, his voice growing louder. You think you've won, that you've destroyed everything I worked for. But you're wrong. I've got nothing left to lose now, which makes me more dangerous than you can imagine.
He began to walk around the clearing, his movements becoming more agitated. I could see the madness in his eyes, the rage that had been building for 2 decades.
You want to know what I did to Curtis Webb? He called out. Your private investigator friend found his body 2 days ago, floating in the river with his throat cut. He told me all about your little games before he died, about how you destroyed his life, turned him into a street drunk, made him desperate enough to do anything for money.
My blood ran cold. Webb was dead, and Jude had killed him. But more importantly, Webb had talked before he died. Jude knew about my investigators, about my network, about the trap I had prepared.
That's right, little sister. I know all about your preparations. I know about the property purchase, the fake documents, the careful manipulation of my associates. You've been playing a long game, but so have I. And my game is about to end yours.
He reached into his jacket and pulled out a pistol. Not the hunting knife he had used to kill our father, but a modern weapon that spoke of careful planning and criminal connections. I'm going to give you one chance to come out and face me like a woman instead of hiding like a scared little girl. If you do, I'll make it quick. If you don't, I'll hunt you down like the animal you are, and when I catch you, I'll make sure you suffer before you die.
I had a choice to make. I could stay hidden and try to take him from a distance, but the angle was poor and the shot would be difficult. Or I could reveal myself and face him in open combat, trusting in my own preparations and the righteousness of my cause.
In the end, the decision was made for me. A branch cracked under my foot as I shifted position, and Jude's head snapped toward my hiding place. There you are," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouts. "My dear little sister, all grown up and ready to play with the big boys." He began to walk toward my position, the pistol held ready. I had seconds to act, and I chose to trust in the planning that had brought me this far. I stood up from behind the log, my rifle trained on his chest. "That's far enough, Jude." He stopped, a smile spreading across his face. "Well, well, look at you all armed and dangerous. Who would have thought that the little girl who used to hide under her bed during thunderstorms would grow up to be a killer?" "I'm not a killer," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear that was coursing through me. "I'm someone who believes in justice."
Justice.
He laughed, the sound echoing through the forest, like the cry of a wounded animal.
You want to talk about justice? I spent 20 years in a cage because of you. 20 years of my life gone because a little girl couldn't keep her mouth shut.
You spent 20 years in prison because you murdered our father in cold blood. Because you're a monster who destroys everything he touches. Our father was a weak man who accepted failure as his fate. I gave him a quick death, which was more mercy than he deserved. And now, I'm going to give you the same gift. He raised the pistol, and I knew that our conversation was over. It was time for action, time for the final confrontation that would determine which of us would survive. But as I prepared to fire, I heard something that stopped me cold, the sound of footsteps approaching through the woods. Someone else was coming, someone who would complicate everything. Jude heard it too, his head turning toward the sound. For a moment, we both remained frozen, unsure of what this new development would bring. Then a voice called out from the forest, a voice I recognized with shock and relief. "Angelina, are you all right?" I heard shouting. It was Sebastian, my husband. He had followed me, worried about my safety, ready to help me face whatever danger awaited in these woods. But his arrival had changed everything. Now, I wasn't just fighting for my own life, I was fighting for his as well. And I knew that Jude would use that against me
would try to hurt the man I loved to get to me.
The stakes had just gotten higher, and the game had become more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Sebastian's voice cut through the tension like a blade, and I saw Jude's eyes light up with a predatory gleam. My husband was walking into a trap, and I was powerless to warn him without revealing my position.
Well, well, Jude said, his voice dropping to a whisper. It seems we have a visitor. Your husband, I presume the man who took my sister's hand in marriage while her brother rotted in prison.
He began to move toward the sound of Sebastian's approach, using the trees as cover. I tracked him with my rifle, but I couldn't get a clean shot without risking hitting Sebastian instead.
Sebastian, stay back, I shouted, finally breaking my silence. Get out of here! Call the police!
But it was too late. Sebastian emerged from the tree line, his face flushed from the climb, his eyes searching for me with concern. He was a good man, a gentle man, completely unprepared for the violence that was about to unfold.
Angelina,
he called out, confusion evident in his voice.
What's going on? Who are you talking to?
That's when Jude stepped out from behind a tree, his pistol trained on Sebastian's back. My husband spun around, his face going pale as he saw the weapon.
You must be the husband,
Jude said, his voice conversational despite the deadly situation. I've heard so much about you. Sebastian, isn't it? The kind, gentle man who married my poor, traumatized sister and helped her build a new life. Sebastian's eyes found mine across the clearing, and I saw understanding dawn in his expression. He knew who this was, what this was about. We had talked about my past, about the brother who had destroyed my family, about the fears that haunted my dreams.
You're Jude,
Sebastian said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes.
Angelina told me about you.
Did she now? Did she tell you about the night I killed our father? About how she watched from the shadows like a little coward, too scared to try to help him? She told me about a frightened child who witnessed a murder and was brave enough to seek justice for her father. Sebastian replied, his voice growing stronger. She told me about a monster who blamed everyone but himself for his crimes.
Jude's face darkened with rage. Brave you call running away and hiding behind the police? Brave you call destroying my life from the shadows? Brave your wife is a coward and a manipulator, just like our father was a failure.
Let him go, Jude. I called out, my rifle still trained on my brother. This is between you and me. He has nothing to do with our family's problems.
Oh, but he does,
Jude replied, pressing the pistol against Sebastian's temple. He's part of the life you built while I was locked away. He's part of the happiness you found while I suffered. That makes him very much my concern. I could see Sebastian's hands shaking, but his voice remained calm. Whatever you're planning, it won't bring you peace. Violence only breeds more violence. It won't heal the wounds in your family. Peace. Jude laughed, the sound bitter and cold. I don't want peace. I want justice. I want my sister to understand what it feels like to lose everything that matters to her. He began to back away, using Sebastian as a human shield, moving toward the apple tree where our father was buried. I followed, keeping my rifle trained on him, looking for an opportunity to take a shot that wouldn't endanger my husband. You know what I realized during my 20 years in prison? Jude continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than his rage. I realized that our father was right about one thing. Some people are born with darkness in their hearts, and that darkness can't be changed or redeemed. It can only be embraced. We had reached the apple tree now, the massive trunk casting long shadows across the ground. Jude positioned himself so that the tree was at his back, giving him protection from any approach from behind. I spent years trying to fight that darkness.
He said, his eyes fixed on mine. I tried to be the son our father wanted, the brother you deserved. But it was always there, waiting, growing stronger, every time I was disappointed, or betrayed, or hurt. He pressed the pistol harder against Sebastian's temple, and I saw my husband wince. And now I've stopped fighting it. I've embraced what I am, what I was always meant to be. I'm the monster you always said I was, and I'm proud of it.
You're sick, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. You need help, not revenge.
Help. Jude's laugh was sharp and bitter. I'm beyond help, sister dear. I'm beyond redemption. I'm beyond everything except the need to see you suffer as I have suffered. That's when I saw it, a slight movement in the shadows behind the apple tree. Someone else was there, someone who had been waiting and watching just as I had been. It was Curtis Webb, but not the broken man I had expected. This was a different Webb, one who had been playing his own game all along. His eyes met mine for a split second, and I saw something there that chilled me to the bone. He wasn't Jude's victim, he was his partner.
Surprise,
Webb said, stepping out from behind the tree with a rifle of his own.
Bet you didn't expect to see me, did you, Mrs. Mason?
The trap I had so carefully prepared had been turned against me. I was surrounded, outnumbered, and the man I loved was caught in the crossfire.
You see Angelina?
Jude said, his voice filled with cold satisfaction. I learned from the best. I learned patience from you, planning from you, and most importantly, I learned that the only way to truly defeat your enemies is to make them believe they've already won.
The situation was desperate, but I wasn't finished yet. I had one advantage: they didn't know about a second rifle hidden in the woods behind me, positioned by Sebastian, before he had entered the clearing. He had been more prepared than I had given him credit for. All I had to do was create a distraction, give him a chance to reach the weapon, and turn the tables on our captors.
You're right, Jude, I said, lowering my rifle slightly. You did learn from me, but you made one mistake.
What's that?
You underestimated the man I married.
Sebastian moved faster than I had ever seen him move, breaking free from Jude's grip and diving toward the hidden rifle. Webb swung his weapon toward my husband, but I was faster, putting a bullet in his chest before he could fire.
Jude's pistol cracked, and Sebastian cried out as the bullet caught him in the shoulder. But he reached the rifle and rolled behind a fallen log, giving us both cover.
The final battle had begun, and I knew that only one side would walk away from it alive.
The forest erupted in gunfire as our carefully planned confrontation descended into chaos. Webb was down, clutching his chest and gasping for air. But Jude was still dangerous, still determined to finish what he had started 20 years ago. Sebastian, despite his wounded shoulder, had managed to reach the second rifle and was providing covering fire from behind the fallen log. Blood stained his shirt, but his eyes were clear and focused. He had transformed from the gentle man I had married into something harder, more dangerous.
You always were resourceful, Jude called out, his voice carrying across the clearing despite the echoing gunshots. But you can't win this, Angelina. Even if you kill me, you'll have to live with the knowledge that you've become exactly what you always claimed to hate.
He was right, and we both knew it. The moment I had decided to lure him here to face him with violence instead of law, I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I had become the very thing I had spent my life fighting against.
But I had also learned something important over the years. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to sacrifice your own innocence. Sometimes the only way to serve justice is to become the instrument of that justice, no matter the cost to your soul.
Maybe you're right, I called back, adjusting my position behind a large oak tree. Maybe I have become a monster, but at least I'm a monster who protects the people I love.
A bullet splintered the bark near my head, and I realized that Jude was maneuvering for a better position. He was trying to get a clear shot at Sebastian to hurt me by destroying the man I loved.
I couldn't let that happen.
I broke cover and ran toward the apple tree, drawing Jude's fire away from my husband. Bullets whistled past me, one close enough to tear through my jacket, but I reached the massive trunk and pressed my back against it. Now I was mere feet from my brother, separated only by the tree that marked our father's grave. I could hear him breathing on the other side, could sense his presence like a dark weight in the air. "Do you remember when we used to play hide and seek in these woods?" I asked, my voice conversational, despite the deadly situation. "You were always better at hiding than I was. You could disappear so completely that I'd think you'd vanished forever." "I remember," he replied, his voice softer now, almost wistful. "I remember when you were just my little sister, before you became my enemy." "I was never your enemy, Jude. I was your victim. There's a difference. You destroyed my life." "No," I said, my voice growing stronger. "You destroyed your own life the moment you decided that other people's lives were worth less than your own desires. You destroyed it when you chose violence over love, revenge over forgiveness." I could hear him moving, circling around the tree, trying to get a clear shot at me. But I was moving too, keeping the massive trunk between us, buying time for Sebastian to flank him from the other side. "You want to know what I learned in prison?" Jude said, his voice growing closer. "I learned that the only difference between the guards and the prisoners was which side of the bars they were on. I learned that everyone is capable of evil, given the right circumstances." "Maybe that's true," I replied, continuing to circle. "But some people choose to fight against that evil while others embrace it. Some people use their pain to help others, while others use it to justify hurting them." Pretty words from someone who's been planning my death for 20 years. He had a point, and I couldn't deny it. But I also couldn't let him continue to spread his poison to threaten the people I loved and the life I had built. "You're right," I said, stopping my movement and pressing my back against the tree. "I did plan your death. I planned it every day for 20 years. But do you know what I realized just now?" "What?" "I realized that I don't want to kill you because I hate you. I want to kill you because I love the people you would hurt. I want to kill you because the world will be safer without you in it." That's when I heard the sound I had been waiting for, Sebastian's rifle being cocked, the soft click of metal on metal that meant he had moved into position behind Jude. "Drop your weapon," Sebastian said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had found his strength. "It's over, Jude. You're surrounded." For a moment there was silence. Then Jude began to laugh, a sound that was equal parts amusement and madness. "You think it's over? You think you've won? Even if you kill me, I've already won. I've turned your precious wife into a killer, made her into the same kind of monster I am. She'll never be free of that, never be able to look at herself in the mirror without seeing my face." The words hit me like physical blows because I knew they were true. I had become something I had never wanted to be, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I had also learned something else sometimes. The price of protecting the innocent is your own innocence. Sometimes the price of justice is your own soul. And I was willing to pay that price. "You're right," I said, stepping out from behind the tree with my rifle raised. "I have become a monster. But unlike you, I became a monster by choice to protect the people I love. I can live with that." Jude spun toward me, his pistol coming up, but Sebastian was faster. The rifle cracked, and my brother staggered backward, a look of surprise crossing his face. He looked down at the spreading stain on his chest, then up at me with eyes that held a mixture of pain and something that might have been pride. "Well played, sister," he whispered, his voice growing weak. "Well played." Then he collapsed, his body falling across the roots of the apple tree where our father was buried. The man who had destroyed my family, who had haunted my dreams for 20 years, was finally dead. But as I stood there looking down at his still form, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected. I felt only a deep, profound sadness for the brother. He might have been the family,
we might have had the innocence we had all lost on that terrible night so long ago. Sebastian came up beside me, his good arm slipping around my waist, and together we stood in the shadow of the apple tree, mourning not just the dead, but the living who had been forever changed by violence and revenge. "It's over," he said softly. "It's finally over." I nodded, but I knew it would never really be over. The scars would always be there. The memories would always haunt me, and the knowledge of what I had become would always be a part of me. But I had protected the people I loved. I had ensured that Jude would never hurt anyone again. And sometimes that has to be enough. Sometimes justice is its own reward, even when it comes at the cost of your own soul. 25 years have passed since that day in the forest, and I am now the 81-year-old woman who began this story. I sit in my rocking chair on the porch of my house in Oak Ridge, watching the children play in the street, handing out peppermint candies to any who ask. Sebastian's wound healed, but it left him with a permanent stiffness in his shoulder that reminded us both of the price we had paid for our peace. He lived another 15 years after that day, and they were good years filled with love and laughter and the quiet contentment that comes from having survived the worst that life can offer. When he died, it was peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the makeshift family we had created together. His children from his first marriage had welcomed me as their stepmother, and their children called me grandmother. I never had children of my own, but I learned that family is not always about blood. Sometimes it's about choice, about the people you decide to love and protect. I never told anyone the full truth about what happened in the forest that day. The official story was that Jude had attempted to rob us, that Sebastian had acted in self-defense when my brother threatened us with a gun. Curtis Webb's death was ruled a separate incident, the result of his involvement with dangerous criminals. The authorities accepted our version of events, perhaps because they wanted to believe that justice had been served, that the man who had murdered his own father had finally met his own violent end. There were no further investigations, no uncomfortable questions, no challenges to our carefully constructed narrative. But I knew the truth, and I lived with it every day. In the quiet moments when the house was still and the night was deep, I would remember the sound of the rifle firing, the look in Jude's eyes as he felt the weight of the choice I had made. Did I regret it? That's a question I asked myself countless times over the years. The answer was complicated, layered with nuance and contradiction. I regretted the loss of innocence, the knowledge that I was capable of violence when pushed to the edge. I regretted the necessity of it, the fact that our family's story had to end in blood and death. But I didn't regret protecting the people I loved. I didn't regret ensuring that Jude would never hurt another innocent person. I didn't regret choosing love over fear, action over paralysis. In the end, I suppose I became exactly what my father had warned me against, someone whose heart had been hardened by the world's evil. But I also became something else, someone who used that hardness to protect the soft places in others, to ensure that they could remain innocent in a world that often punished innocence. The children who visit my porch see only a kind old woman who tells stories and shares candy. They don't know about the darkness I carry, the choices I made, the prices I paid. They see only the surface, the quilts I make, the charity work I do, the gentle smile I offer to anyone who needs it. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the true measure of a life is not the darkness you carry, but the light you choose to share despite that darkness. Maybe redemption is not about erasing your sins, but about using them to become someone who can help others avoid making the same mistakes. I have spent the last 25 years trying to be that person, the woman who learned from her own darkness how to help others find their light. I have counseled young women who were trapped in violent relationships, helped families torn apart by addiction and abuse, supported children who had witnessed things no child should see. In each of them, I saw something of myself, the scared little girl who had watched her father die, who had lived in terror of her own brother, who had learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to become something you never wanted to be. And in helping them, I found a kind of peace that I had never expected. Not the peace of forgiveness or redemption, but the peace of purpose of knowing that my suffering had meaning, that my choices had made a difference. As I sit here in my rocking chair, watching the sun set over the mountains that shaped my childhood, I think about the long journey that brought me to this moment. It was not the life I had planned, not the story I had wanted to tell, but it was the life I had lived, the story I had written with my own choices and actions. And if I had to do it all over again, knowing what I know now, understanding the full cost of the path I chose, I would make the same choices. I would pay the same prices. I would become the same person I became, because that person was able to protect the people she loved and help others find their way through the darkness. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. Choose love over fear, protection over passivity, action over inaction. Sometimes the only way to defeat the monsters in our lives is to become strong enough to face them, even if that strength comes with its own darkness. The little girl who witnessed her father's murder learned that lesson in the cruelest way possible. But she learned it, and she lived it, and she used it to make the world a little safer for others. And in the end, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can ask for, the chance to turn our pain into purpose, our darkness into light, our suffering into service. The sun has set now, and the porch light casts a warm glow over the street. Somewhere in the distance, a child is laughing, and the sound carries on the evening air like a promise of hope. I close my eyes and listen to that laughter, and for a moment, I am at peace with the choices I made, the life I lived, the woman I became. It is enough. It has to be enough, because it is all I have, and it is all I am, and it is the only story I have to tell.